The principal called me into his office and asked, "Is your bus stop still number 67? Why, are they changing the routes or something?" I laughed a little because what kind of random question was that? His face turned ghost white. "Do not leave this office. Do not leave this room." The secretary dropped her coffee mug and it shattered all over the floor, but she didn't even look at it. She just started dialing numbers on her phone with shaking hands. I could hear my mom's ringtone going off in my pocket over and over, but Healy grabbed my arm when I reached for it. "What's going on?" My voice came out higher than I wanted. The security guard appeared outside the office door and I watched him lock it from the outside. Through the window, I could see teachers herding kids into classrooms like there was a tornado drill, but no alarm was going off. Healy kept looking out toward the parking lot and checking his watch. "Sir, I need to know what's happening." I was trying to stay calm, but everyone was acting like I had a bomb strapped to my chest or something. The IT director burst through the door with a stack of printed emails. The timestamps match. Every morning, 7:10 to 7:25. The way he said it made my skin crawl. He handed the papers to Healy, who scanned them quickly, his face getting paler with each page. That's when the door burst open. It was my math teacher, the one known for giving everyone extra homework and detention for no reason, carrying a Snickers bar and a can of Coke. "Here you go, honey." The pity in her eyes made me shiver. "Do you have siblings at other schools?" Healy asked while typing something on his computer. "No, just me. Can someone please tell me what this is about?" The janitor kept walking past the office window with his mop bucket, but he never actually mopped anything, just kept looking in at me and then pretending to check his supplies. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing, and I could see texts piling up from my mom in all caps. A police officer walked in and went straight to Healy without even looking at me. "We need all the students who wear blue backpacks." I looked down at my blue JanSport and felt my stomach drop even though I didn't know why. The secretary was on the phone saying something about canceling the field trip to Delaney Park, which made no sense because that wasn't until next month. By this point, 3 teachers were standing guard outside the office door and none of them would look at me when I tried to make eye contact. The officer's radio crackled. "Vehicle moving from Cedar to Chestnut Street. Red Hyundai." The secretary's hands hovered over her keyboard. Even the janitor stopped his fake cleaning routine. Next to me, someone dropped a folder and photos scattered across the floor. I caught a glimpse of backpacks, different colored ones, all photographed from weird angles. But before I could pick any of them up, Mrs. Betty appeared. The same teacher who gave me detention last week for chewing gum was now looking at me with tears in her eyes. "How's your family? Is everyone doing okay?" I couldn't even answer because nothing made sense. She hated me yesterday and now she was crying about my family. That's when the room shifted. Healy pulled up something on his laptop and turned it toward the officer, who gasped. "It's all the morning kids," someone whispered. He documented their patterns. Every single one. Healy spun around and held my hand. "That's your stop in the photos, right? Stop 67? You get on there every morning at 7:15? I nodded because I couldn't make the words come out. He let go of me and practically ran to the window, scanning the parking lot again. Enough was enough. As soon as he wasn't looking, I grabbed his laptop screen and faced it towards me. That's when I saw it. Photos. Dozens of them. All of bus stop 67. All with timestamps from 7:10 to 7:25 a.m. And in every single photo, circled in red marker, was my blue backpack. Healy turned back to me and sighed. "Mr. Clancy has been watching you for 18 months. The name hit me like ice water. That weird substitute from last year who only lasted a week before disappearing. The one who kept asking girls if they needed tutoring even though he was just subbing for Jim. He's been documenting you since March 2023 when you sang at the talent show." My stomach churned as he clicked through folder after folder. Each month contained dozens of photos of me waiting at my bus stop, completely unaware I was being watched. Photos of my house, my bedroom window marked with arrows, notes about our broken back gate that Dad never fixed. He'd been studying my family like we were some kind of science experiment, waiting for the perfect opportunity to take me. They said I was safe now. Healy promised my parents that Clancy would never come near me again. For a couple weeks, I actually believed them. And a month later, they broke the news. Clancy was released. Turns out taking photos isn't illegal. But what I did next definitely was. I sat in my car outside the courthouse for 3 hours watching people come and go before I finally saw him. Clancy walked out with his lawyer and shook the guy's hand like they'd just closed a business deal instead of getting a stalker off on a technicality. My hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to make my knuckles white, but they weren't shaking anymore. Not like they did a month ago when Healy first showed me all those photos. I knew exactly what I was going to do. The plan had been forming in my head since the prosecutor called to say they were dropping the charges because taking pictures of minors from public property wasn't technically illegal unless you could prove intent to harm. I started my car and followed Clancy's beat-up Toyota at a distance, noting which streets he took and where he stopped for gas. He bought cigarettes and an energy drink while I stayed in my car taking pictures of him with my phone, thinking about how this is what he'd done to me for 18 months. The drive to Trudy's house took 20 minutes, but I made it in 15, running 2 yellow lights and barely stopping at the stop sign on her street. She opened the door before I even knocked because she'd been watching from her bedroom window after I texted her that Clancy was free. Her face told me she already knew what I was thinking, and that she understood why the system failing me like this felt worse than the stalking itself. We went straight to her room and locked the door even though her parents were at work. I pulled out my laptop and showed her the screenshots I'd been taking of everything the detective had shown me during the investigation, including Clancy's work schedule and home address that they'd accidentally left visible on their computer screen. Trudy grabbed her own laptop and started pulling up property records while I mapped out his daily routine based on what the detective had let slip during questioning about when they'd tried to arrest him. We worked until 3 in the morning, cross-referencing everything we knew about his patterns with the timestamps from those photos he'd taken of me. Trudy found his apartment complex on Google Maps, and we studied the layout, noting all the exits and where the parking lot cameras were positioned. I made a list of everything we'd need while she researched how to create fake accounts and use VPNs to hide our internet activity. Neither of us said out loud what we were planning, but we both knew we were crossing a line that we couldn't come back from. The next morning, I went home and told my parents I needed to stay with Trudy for a few days to feel safer after hearing about Clancy's release. Mom hugged me too tight and kept asking if I was sure I'd be okay while Dad finally promised to fix that broken back gate he'd been putting off for 2 years. They had no idea I was counting on them believing I was still the same scared girl from a month ago who just wanted to hide from the world. I packed a bag with dark clothes and told them I'd check in every day, knowing they'd give me space because the therapist had told them I needed to process things my own way. Trudy picked me up in her mom's gray sedan instead of her bright yellow Bug that everyone in town recognized from the senior parking lot. We drove past Clancy's apartment complex 3 times, noting which car was his beat-up Toyota, and watching his lights go on at 6 p.m. when he got home from wherever he'd been. The complex had visitor parking that didn't require a pass and no security guard, just a broken gate that never closed properly. We timed how long it took to drive from his place to mine, then to the school, then to the bus stop where he'd taken most of the photos. On the second pass, we saw him come out to smoke on his balcony, and I took pictures of him standing there, thinking about how he'd documented my whole life without me knowing. Trudy kept track of when his lights went off at 11 p.m. and came back on at 5 a.m. when he left for work. The next day, we followed him to a hardware store 2 towns over where he'd apparently gotten a job stocking shelves, probably the only place that would hire him after the news coverage of his arrest. I went in wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, walking right past him in aisle 3 where he was organizing boxes of screws. The manager at the register didn't recognize me when I bought zip ties, duct tape, and a small tarp, paying cash like I'd seen people do in movies when they didn't want to leave a trail. I asked about their security cameras while making small talk, and he mentioned they only kept footage for 72 hours before recording over it. We followed Clancy after his shift to a storage unit facility on the outskirts of town, where he spent exactly 1 hour before leaving. Trudy stayed in the car with the engine running while I walked into the office and sweet-talked the manager, a guy named Sean McCarty who looked about 25 and clearly enjoyed the attention. I told him I was thinking about renting a unit for my family's extra furniture and asked for a tour, making sure to watch when he entered the gate code. Sean showed me 3 different units and mentioned that Tuesday and Thursday were the quietest days with hardly anyone around. That night, I couldn't sleep, laying in Trudy's guest bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about those 18 months of photos. The law said it was perfectly fine for him to document every detail of my life as long as he didn't physically touch me or explicitly threaten me. My phone showed 43 missed calls from Mom, but I texted her back that I was okay and just needed space to process everything. She sent back a string of heart emojis and said she loved me, making my chest tight with guilt about what I was planning. The next day, Trudy started having doubts when I showed her the bottles I'd ordered from a medical supply website using a fake name and shipped to an Amazon locker across town. She held one up and said this wasn't who I was, that I was a good person who sang in the talent show and helped freshmen with their homework. I reminded her that the girl she was talking about got stalked for 18 months, while the law did absolutely nothing to protect her. We drove to an abandoned warehouse on the industrial side of town, where kids sometimes went to drink and spray paint the walls. Trudy set a timer on her phone while I practiced what we'd planned, running through each step over and over until we could do everything in under 4 minutes. My hands stayed steady the whole time, not shaking even once, which scared Trudy more than anything else we'd done so far. 3 days later, I was picking up milk at the grocery store when Wallace Elder grabbed my arm near the dairy section. He looked around to make sure nobody was listening before leaning in close. His wife Virginia was with him, and she kept wringing her hands like she was nervous about something. Wallace told me Clancy had been asking about me at the gas station and the post office. Virginia said she saw his car parked across from the school last Tuesday, even though he wasn't allowed within 500 feet. My hands started shaking so bad I almost dropped the milk carton. They gave me their phone number on a receipt and said to call if I needed anything. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what they said. I pulled my old phone out of the drawer and charged it up. The next morning, I set it up in my bedroom window behind the curtain, angled to record the street. I left it plugged in and recording all night. Nothing happened the first 2 nights, but on night 3, I checked the footage and there it was. His red car driving past my house 6 times between midnight and 3 in the morning. Each pass, he slowed down near my driveway. I showed Trudy the video and she said we needed to take it to the police right away. But I knew better than that. They'd just give him another warning and he'd be more careful next time. So I kept recording every night for a whole week. By the end, I had 23 separate instances of him driving by my house after dark. Some nights he'd park at the corner for 10 minutes before driving past again. I saved all the footage to multiple flash drives and hid them in different places. Then I started leaving breadcrumbs for him to follow. I made a Facebook post about visiting my cousin in Denver next weekend, even though I didn't have a cousin there. The next day, I had a loud phone conversation with Mom about joining the track team while standing near the open window. I posted on Instagram about going to the mall with friends on Saturday afternoon. Each lie was a test to see if he'd show up at those places. Sure enough, Trudy spotted his car in the mall parking lot that Saturday, right where I said I'd be. We took pictures of him sitting in his car watching the entrance. 2 weeks into this, I got lucky. The hardware store manager called Clancy in for inventory on his day off. I knew because I'd been calling pretending to be his niece worried about him. The girl at the register bought it and told me his whole schedule. This gave us 4 hours while he was stuck at work. Trudy drove us to the storage facility, and I punched in the code I'd memorized from watching Sean enter it. We found Unit 47B, and I used the bolt cutters I'd bought with cash 2 towns over. The lock snapped easier than I expected. Inside, there were boxes stacked to the ceiling. We pulled one down and opened it. Photos spilled out everywhere. Not just of me, but 3 other girls I didn't recognize. All of them looked around my age. All of them photographed without knowing. Trudy took pictures of everything with her phone while I planted the bottles I'd ordered online. I pushed them into a corner behind some boxes where they'd be found if police searched, but not obvious to Clancy. One of the girls in the photos looked familiar. I stared at her face until it clicked. She was that girl from Riverside who went missing 2 years ago. The one they found at a bus station 3 days later. She never said what happened to her. My stomach felt sick realizing Clancy had been doing this for years. We put everything back exactly how we found it. I wore the gloves and hairnet Trudy stole from her mom's catering supplies. We replaced the lock with an identical one I'd bought. The security camera pointed at the building across from his unit, just like Sean had mentioned during my tour. We were in and out in 37 minutes. That night, I went to the library and used their computer to create a Gmail account. I typed up detailed tips about Clancy's storage unit and the photos inside. I sent the same email to 3 different police departments, including Riverside. I wore Dad's baseball cap pulled low to avoid the library cameras. Then I walked to the coffee shop and used their WIFI to send another tip from a different email account. I made sure to mention the missing girl from Riverside and gave the exact unit number. 2 days went by and nothing happened. The police hadn't searched his unit. Clancy was still driving by my house every night, so I decided to push harder. I used the burner phone I'd bought at a gas station to call 911. I made my voice sound older and said I was Clancy's neighbor. I told them I heard screaming from his apartment and I was worried someone was hurt. I hung up before they could ask questions. 20 minutes later, I watched from across the street as 2 police cars pulled up to his building. They knocked on his door and he had to let them in. They were there for an hour but didn't find anything. Still, it rattled him. The next 3 nights, he didn't drive by my house at all. But on the 4th night, Wallace texted me a video from his doorbell camera at 2 in the morning. Clancy's truck was parked outside his building and he was hauling boxes up the stairs, looking over his shoulder every few seconds like someone might be watching. I watched him make 7 trips total, moving everything from his storage unit into his tiny apartment. Wallace didn't ask why I wanted to know about Clancy's movements, but the way he sent the video without any message told me he understood. Friday came and I knew from watching him for weeks that he went to Murphy's bar after work. I waited in my car until I saw him go inside and take his usual spot at the end of the bar. The place was pretty empty for a Friday, just a few regulars watching the game on TV. I walked in wearing my dad's old baseball cap and sat 3 seats away from him. When he got up to use the bathroom, I moved fast. The small packet I'd ordered online dissolved in his beer in seconds. Nothing that would really hurt him, just something that would show up in a blood test. I was back in my seat scrolling my phone when he came back. He drank the rest of his beer and ordered another one. 20 minutes later, he started sweating and grabbed the bar to steady himself. The bartender called an ambulance when Clancy threw up all over the floor. At the hospital, they ran a bunch of tests and found the substance in his system. The next morning, a detective called asking if I knew anything about it. I told him I was at the movies with friends and had the ticket stubs to prove it. Clancy filed a police report saying someone was trying to poison him, but the detective who'd worked my stalking case seemed to think he was making it up for attention. Trudy came over that night and found me going through the GPS tracker website on my laptop. She sat on my bed and started crying. She said we were becoming just as bad as him, maybe worse. She said her mom was starting to ask questions about where she went at night. I told her she could leave if she wanted, but I wasn't stopping now. The system gave me no choice when they let him walk free after 18 months of stalking me. She packed up the supplies we'd been keeping in my closet and left without saying goodbye. Working alone felt different, but not harder. I downloaded a voice changer app and used the burner phone I'd bought at a gas station 3 towns over. I called the hardware store and told them I knew what Clancy had done and he'd pay for it. The manager reported it to police and Clancy got more paranoid. He started showing up to work late and leaving early, always checking over his shoulder. The police finally got a warrant for his storage unit based on all the anonymous tips I'd been sending from library computers. They found it mostly empty except for the bottles I'd planted weeks earlier. The bottles had a harmless liquid inside, but it looked suspicious enough that they had to send it for testing. While they were busy with that, I watched YouTube videos about car locks until I figured out how to break into Clancy's beat-up Honda. I wore gloves and a hoodie with the hood up even though it was hot outside. The GPS tracker fit perfectly under his driver's seat where he'd never think to look. The app on my burner phone showed me everywhere he went. He still drove by my house every single night around 11:30, so I started making sure I was somewhere else each time, somewhere with cameras. I'd go to the 24-hour grocery store or the gas station, or just sit in the coffee shop parking lot where their security camera could see me. My parents thought I was doing better, staying busy and getting out of the house. They didn't know I was building a pattern of alibis for when I'd need them. Clara showed up at my house on a Tuesday morning saying she wanted to check in. She was the victim advocate they'd assigned to my case, and she had this way of looking at you like she could see right through you. She asked if I was planning anything, if I had thoughts about taking matters into my own hands. I started crying on cue, telling her how scared I still was, and how unfair it felt that he was free. She hugged me and promised to push for better protection, maybe even get the restraining order extended. After she left, I checked the tracker and saw Clancy was at Murphy's again. I drove by but didn't go in. Through the window, I could see him talking to some guys at the bar, waving his hands around like he was upset about something. Later, I found out from the bartender's daughter who went to my school that he'd been telling everyone someone was framing him. He said the teenage girl he'd photographed was actually some kind of evil genius trying to destroy his life. Nobody believed him, though. Who's going to trust a grown man who stalked a high school girl over the actual victim? His desperation was making him look more dangerous and unstable, which honestly helped my case more than anything else I'd done. The GPS tracker became my new best friend over the next 2 weeks. Every morning, I'd check the app and see where Clancy had been the night before. He had a routine just like I used to have at bus stop 67. Mondays, he went to the laundromat on Maple Street around 8. Tuesdays and Thursdays were grocery store nights. Wednesdays, he'd sit in his car outside the library for hours. I started showing up at these places about 10 minutes after he left. At the laundromat, I told the owner I thought someone had been following me there. I made my voice shake and kept looking over my shoulder. She remembered seeing Clancy and said he'd been acting weird, staring at young girls folding clothes. At the grocery store, I talked to 3 different cashiers about a creepy guy who might be stalking me. They all remembered Clancy buying the same things every Tuesday. The library security guard took notes when I said I was scared to study there anymore. Within a week, I had 7 different people who could confirm seeing Clancy at places where I claimed to feel unsafe. None of them knew I was only there because the tracker told me he'd just left. The whole thing was working perfectly until that Thursday afternoon at the mall parking lot. I'd followed the tracker signal to JCPenney where he'd been shopping for work clothes. I waited until he left, and then went inside to tell mall security about feeling followed. But when I came back out 20 minutes later, Clancy was standing by my car. His face was red and his hands were shaking. He started screaming before I could even react. "I know what you're doing, you little psycho." His voice echoed across the parking lot. People stopped loading their cars to stare at us. "You're following me and making everyone think I'm after you." I dropped my shopping bag and started backing away. "Help me, please, somebody help." My scream was real because he looked completely unhinged. 3 guys from the loading dock ran over and grabbed him before he could take another step. One of them was huge and pinned Clancy's arms behind his back. "She's lying, she's setting me up!" Clancy kept yelling while they held him down. The mall security I'd just talked to came running out with 2 other guards. They already thought he was dangerous because of what I'd just told them inside. Someone called 911 and the police showed up in under 5 minutes. The officer who took my statement was the same one from the original case. I made myself cry while telling him how Clancy had been waiting by my car. The 3 dock workers all said Clancy seemed violent and unstable. One of them mentioned Clancy had been reaching into his pocket before they grabbed him. Nobody found anything, but it sounded threatening in the police report. The security footage showed Clancy approaching my car and screaming at me. It didn't show that I'd led him there on purpose by parking right next to his Honda. They arrested him for violating the restraining order, and this time there were 8 witnesses. While they loaded him into the police car, I heard him telling the officer someone was framing him. The officer just shook his head and said stalkers always claim that. They kept him in custody for 3 days before his bail hearing. That gave me plenty of time to visit his apartment. I'd found his spare key weeks ago taped inside his mailbox. Wallace Elder saw me going in but didn't say anything. He probably figured I was a relative or girlfriend. The apartment smelled like old pizza and dirty laundry. I wore gloves and kept my hair in a tight bun with a hairnet underneath. His journal was right on his desk like he wanted someone to find it. The first entry was from 2 years ago about a girl named Ashley from his old job. Then pages and pages about me starting from the talent show. He wrote about my voice and how I looked in my blue dress. He had a whole section about following my bus route and learning my schedule. There were drawings of my house with measurements and notes about entry points. I photographed every single page with my burner phone. The last entry was from yesterday, complaining about being followed and harassed. He wrote that someone was trying to destroy him, but nobody would listen. I left everything exactly where I found it and locked up behind me. The prosecutor called my parents the next day about offering Clancy a deal. 6 months jail time plus mandatory psychiatric treatment and extended probation. My dad was furious it wasn't more, but the prosecutor said it was better than risking trial. but Clancy refused the deal. His lawyer tried to argue entrapment and said someone was orchestrating everything against his client. The prosecutor asked for proof, and the lawyer had nothing except Clancy's paranoid rants. Meanwhile, I started my campaign of spreading fear around town. At the coffee shop, I mentioned weird calls where someone just breathed into the phone. At the school, I told teachers about seeing the same car following me home. At the grocery store, I asked the manager if they had security cameras because I felt unsafe. Every story was vague enough that I never actually accused Clancy, but everyone knew who I meant when I talked about my stalker maybe getting out soon. The whole town started watching for him and reporting any sighting to police. That Sunday night, Trudy showed up at my door. She looked tired and said she couldn't stay away knowing what I was going through. We didn't talk about what we'd done before. Instead, she helped me create perfect alibis for the nights Clancy claimed someone was harassing him. We studied at the library where cameras recorded us from 6 to 10 p.m. We went to the 24-hour diner where the waitress knew us by name. Every single time Clancy said someone called or followed him, I had proof I was somewhere public with Trudy. The police searched Clancy's apartment the next week and found his journal. They also found a box of printed photos under his bed. Not just of me, but 3 other girls, including one who'd gone missing 2 years ago. She was found safe, but nobody knew Clancy had been watching her. The detective called it an escalating pattern of predatory behavior. The other girls were contacted, and 2 of them remembered seeing him around their schools. One girl's parents wanted to press charges for their daughter's case, too. Everything was snowballing exactly how I'd planned. I started seeing a therapist that Clara recommended. Her name was Dr. Dickerson, and she specialized in trauma from stalking cases. I told her about nightmares and anxiety and how I was slowly learning to feel safe again. She wrote detailed notes about my excellent progress and healthy coping strategies. After 3 sessions, she said I was remarkably resilient for someone so young. Her reports would be perfect if anything went to trial. The best part came when Clancy's lawyer subpoenaed my phone records. 3 months of texts and calls showing nothing but normal teenage stuff. Messages with mom about dinner and homework. Group chats about school drama. Not a single call to Clancy or anyone connected to him. They had no idea about the burner phone I'd already destroyed or the library computers I'd used. My official phone was completely clean because I'd kept it that way on purpose. 2 weeks later, the pre-trial hearing finally came, and I sat in the courtroom wearing the same blue dress Clara picked out for me. My parents flanked me on both sides while Clancy sat at the defense table looking thinner than before. The prosecutor was laying out evidence when Clancy suddenly stood up and started yelling. He pointed right at me, screaming that I was evil and destroying his life on purpose. His face turned red and spit flew from his mouth as he ranted about being framed. The bailiffs grabbed his arms, but he kept screaming that I knew what I was doing. I let tears roll down my face and grabbed my mom's hand while looking terrified. The judge banged his gavel 3 times before ordering Clancy removed from the courtroom. Before they dragged him out, he screamed one more time that I was the real monster here. The judge looked disgusted and ordered a full psychiatric evaluation to determine if Clancy was even competent to stand trial. The prosecutor said this outburst proved how dangerous and unstable he was becoming. My dad rubbed my back while I pretended to shake from the confrontation. 3 days later, Wallace called me from the grocery store parking lot. He said Clancy had been asking around the neighborhood trying to find someone to investigate me. Wallace heard him on the phone begging some private investigator to take his case for cheap. The guy wanted $5,000 up front, but Clancy's bank account was empty from lawyer fees. Wallace said Clancy looked desperate and was even trying to sell his car for cash. His wife Virginia had seen him going through trash cans looking for bottles to return for deposits. The isolation and poverty were breaking him down faster than anything I could have planned. That same week, the storage facility manager called my cell phone during lunch. He told me Clancy's unit was going up for auction next Tuesday for 3 months unpaid rent. I asked how much the minimum bid would be, and he said probably $200. I told Trudy about it that afternoon, and she immediately understood what needed to happen. We drove to the auction wearing baseball caps and sunglasses like we were in some spy movie. I bid $250 cash using a fake name I'd practiced signing. Nobody else even wanted the junk in that unit, but I needed to make sure it all disappeared. We loaded everything into Trudy's uncle's pickup truck and drove straight to his farm. Her uncle was out of town, so we had the whole place to ourselves. We burned every single photo and document in the incinerator behind the barn. The smoke smelled weird from all the photochemicals, but we stood there until nothing was left but ash. Trudy used a shovel to scatter the ashes across the cow pasture, while I made sure no scraps survived. The next Monday morning, Detective Williams showed up at my house asking to review the timeline one more time. He had a notebook full of dates and times that he kept checking while asking me questions. Where was I the night Clancy claimed someone called him 37 times? I showed him my library study group attendance sheet signed by the librarian. What about the evening someone supposedly followed him home from work? I pulled up Instagram photos from Trudy's birthday dinner that night with timestamps. He asked about the storage unit, and I acted confused, saying I didn't know Clancy even had one. Every answer matched perfectly because Trudy and I had rehearsed this exact conversation 50 times. He kept watching my face for any sign I was lying, but I stayed calm and consistent. After an hour, he finally left, but I could tell he wasn't satisfied. 2 weeks passed before the psychiatric evaluation results came back, and the prosecutor called to update us. The doctor found Clancy suffered from paranoid delusions and an unhealthy fixation on teenage girls. He believed shadowy forces were conspiring against him but couldn't provide any proof. The report said his paranoia might be partially justified but was clearly exaggerated to delusional levels. The prosecutor said this report would destroy any credibility Clancy had left with a jury. My mom cried with relief while I acted grateful but not vindictive about the news. The next week, Clara suggested I start volunteering at the Victims Advocacy Center downtown. She said it would help my healing process and look good on college applications. I spent 3 afternoons a week answering phones and filing paperwork for other stalking victims. The other volunteers treated me like some kind of hero for surviving what I went through. After a month, Clara wrote me a glowing recommendation letter for my early admission applications. She called me resilient and inspiring and said I turned trauma into purpose. The letter made me sound like the perfect victim who channeled pain into helping others. Nobody suspected that same victim was systematically destroying her stalker's life piece by piece. Everything changed when the prosecutor discovered Clancy had crossed state lines to photograph another girl. She lived 40 miles away in a different state, and he'd driven there 6 times. That made it federal, which meant serious prison time if convicted at trial. The prosecutor called to tell me they were adding federal charges to the case. I gasped and said I was relieved, but made sure not to sound happy about it. She said this basically guaranteed he'd never walk free again if convicted. That night, Trudy came over and we started planning how to end our campaign. We'd accomplished enough to ensure Clancy would be locked away for years. We gathered all the burner phones and smashed them with hammers in my garage. The pieces went into different dumpsters across town over the next week. I retrieved the GPS tracker from his impounded car by pretending to look for my missing earring. We dissolved it in acid from Trudy's chemistry set and poured it down 3 different drains. Every scrap of evidence connecting us to anything illegal got destroyed methodically and completely. By March, his public defender finally convinced him to take a plea deal. 5 years in federal prison plus lifetime registration as a sex offender. Clancy kept insisting he was framed but accepted to avoid potentially 20 years if convicted. The judge scheduled sentencing for April 10th and asked if I wanted to give a victim impact statement. I spent 2 weeks writing and rewriting my statement with Clara's help. The morning of sentencing, I stood at the podium in the same blue dress from before. I talked about taking my power back through legal channels and community support. I thanked the prosecutor and police for believing me when Clancy tried to paint me as the villain. I said I was grateful for the justice system that protected me when I felt most vulnerable. The judge nodded along and praised my strength and resilience in the face of trauma. She said I was an inspiration to other victims and should be proud of how I handled everything. Clancy stared at me the whole time with pure hatred in his eyes. He knew what I'd done, but nobody would ever believe him over the brave teenage survivor. The judge banged her gavel and said 5 years, and I watched Clancy's shoulders drop as the bailiff moved toward him with the cuffs. His lawyer, this tired-looking guy in a cheap suit, walked straight over to where my parents and I were sitting. He said something about suspicious circumstances and how they might appeal, but then my dad stood up and mentioned Eric Lassiter's name, our family lawyer who handled big cases, and said we were ready to sue for harassment if they kept bothering us. The lawyer's face changed, and he backed away without another word, and that was the last time anyone from Clancy's side ever contacted us. 2 weeks later, I sat at my computer staring at the acceptance email from State University, early admission for fall semester. My essay about turning trauma into purpose and becoming an advocate for other victims had made the admissions committee cry, according to the note they included. They offered me a partial scholarship and invited me to speak at freshman orientation about campus safety. Nobody reading that essay would ever guess that the justice I wrote about wasn't the kind that happened in courtrooms. Trudy came over that night and we sat in my car in the driveway for 3 hours. She kept picking at the steering wheel cover while we talked about everything we'd done over the past few months. She said we could never talk about it again after tonight, that this had to be the last time. I watched her face in the dashboard light and she looked older somehow, like what we did aged her 5 years. She told me I saved myself when nobody else would, and maybe that made all the guilt worth carrying. We hugged for a long time, and then she got out and walked to her car without looking back. 3 nights later, I woke up crying so hard I couldn't breathe. Mom heard me from down the hall and came running in, wrapping her arms around me while I sobbed into her shoulder. She kept saying it was okay, that what Clancy did would haunt anyone, that crying was normal after everything I'd been through. I let her believe it was about being stalked because I couldn't tell her the truth, that I was crying because I'd become someone who could destroy another person's life piece by piece without hesitation. She held me until I fell asleep and never asked questions when she found me crying again 2 weeks later. The local news station called asking if I'd do an interview about my recovery. The reporter, this woman with perfect teeth and too much hairspray, sat across from me in our living room while the camera guy adjusted the lights. She asked how I was healing, and I talked about community support and the justice system working. She asked what advice I'd give other victims, and I said to trust the process and lean on people who care about you. The segment aired that night with the title, Local Teens Inspiring Recovery After Stalking Ordeal, and they showed pictures of me smiling at the school events. Mom recorded it and posted it on Facebook, where it got hundreds of likes and comments about how brave I was. I smiled for every camera and interview they asked for, but inside I felt empty. knowing they were celebrating a version of me that didn't really exist. Summer came and went in a blur of graduation parties and college prep. 6 months after that day in Healy's office when everything started, I found myself walking past bus stop 67 on my way to get coffee. I stopped and looked at the bench where I used to wait every morning, completely unaware that Clancy was watching and taking pictures. The fear that used to make my chest tight was gone. He was locked up in federal prison 3 states away, and would be for years. The detective had called last month to tell me they'd notified all the other girls from his photos, and most of them were getting counseling now. At least something good came from everything I did, even if they'd never know my role in making sure he got caught with enough evidence to put him away. I ran into Wallace at the grocery store while buying supplies for my dorm room. He stopped me by the cereal aisle and said he was glad I was safe now, that Clancy got exactly what he deserved. The way he looked at me when he said it made me think he knew more than he should, but he just patted my shoulder and walked away. His wife Virginia waved from the next aisle and mouthed, "Stay strong," before they left. College started in August, and I threw myself into the role everyone expected. During orientation, I gave a speech to 300 freshmen about recognizing stalking behavior and using campus resources. The counseling center asked me to lead a support group for assault survivors. My criminal justice professor used my story as an example of the system working when communities come together. I became the poster child for surviving trauma the right way, through legal channels and proper support systems. Nobody sitting in those rooms listening to me talk about trusting the system knew that I'd spent months operating completely outside of it. Trudy went to a different school 4 hours away, but we texted every day. She sent me pictures of her dorm room and her new friends, but we had this connection that went deeper than anything she'd have with them. Late at night, she'd call and we'd talk about classes and boys and normal stuff, but sometimes there would be silence and I knew we were both thinking about what we'd done. She told me she still had nightmares where police showed up at her door, but then she'd see my Instagram posts about thriving at college and remember why we did it. Spring semester of my freshman year, I was studying in the library when my phone buzzed with a news alert. Clancy had been attacked in prison by other inmates who found out he was in for stalking teenage girls. 3 men cornered him in the shower and beat him so badly he spent 2 weeks in the medical ward. The article said he'd recover, but would have permanent scars on his face. I read it 3 times waiting to feel something. Satisfaction maybe, or guilt, but there was nothing. Just empty acknowledgement that actions have consequences that keep growing even after you think you're done. 2 years passed before my parents came for Parents' Weekend at college. They walked around campus taking pictures of everything while I showed them the criminal justice building where I spent most of my time. Mom kept telling other parents how proud she was that I turned my experience into helping others. Dad pulled me aside near the dining hall and mentioned he finally fixed the back gate at home. I actually laughed at that. A real laugh for the first time in forever. They had no idea their daughter had spent months planning and executing perfect revenge against a man who was now rotting in federal prison. Clara Haynes called me the next month about speaking at a conference for victim advocates. She said I was the perfect example of healthy recovery through proper channels, and my story would inspire other survivors. I accepted immediately, knowing that even though my path wasn't what she thought, maybe hearing my public story would help someone else trust the system I had to work around. Junior year flew by with me throwing myself into every class about stalking laws and victim protection. My thesis advisor kept saying my work was deeply personal and insightful when I turned in draft after draft about legal failures in stalking cases. He had no clue how personal it really was, or that I'd lived through exactly what happens when those laws fail. Graduation day came faster than expected, and I walked across that stage knowing I'd earned every bit of my summa cum laude through studying the system that failed me. Healy showed up at the ceremony and found me after, shaking my hand and saying he always knew I was stronger than the situation. He mentioned Clancy would be in prison for at least 3 more years on the federal charges. I smiled and thanked him, realizing I had truly won this war. The law school acceptance letter came with a full scholarship. The admissions committee writing about how my background as a stalking survivor who became an advocate made me their ideal candidate. They had no idea they were accepting someone who took justice into her own hands when the system failed. Trudy called screaming with excitement when I told her, and we both knew this was the path I was meant to take. 3 years of law school passed in a blur of cases and statutes and mock trials. Then Trudy got engaged to some guy she met at work and asked me to be her maid of honor. Standing beside her at that outdoor wedding, I talked about friendship through dark times without mentioning just how dark things got. Her new husband had no idea the woman standing next to his bride had helped her destroy a predator. We locked eyes during the ceremony, and I saw she was thinking the same thing. The bar exam results came exactly 5 years after that day in Healy's office when everything started. I passed on the first try to got hired as a prosecutor specializing in stalking and harassment cases. My first case was against a man who'd been following his ex-girlfriend for months, taking pictures and leaving notes. I built the case carefully using every legal tool available, presenting evidence that left no room for doubt. The jury came back guilty on all counts, and the judge sentenced him to 4 years. Walking out of that courtroom, I realized I'd finally become who I was meant to be. The scared girl who was stalked for 18 months was gone. In her place stood a prosecutor who knew exactly what victims go through when the system fails them. I work within the law now, but I understand why some people can't wait for justice. Every case I win is for them, for us, for everyone who's been told that being watched and photographed isn't really a crime. Clancy created a monster when he stalked me, just not the kind he expected. Thanks for letting me share my 2 cents along the way. It's been quite the ride together. Until our paths cross again. Like the video, it helps more than you think.